Hello, today we're going to talk about tooling that works for everyone using GitHub Actions. But before we start, who is this person talking to right now? So my name is Ben Greenberg, and I am a professional API wrangler, also known as a developer advocate at Orbit, which is the mission control for community builders. Ruby is my happy programming language, although I do like other languages as well, but Ruby just brings me a lot of joy. I'm originally from San Diego, and I now live outside Tel Aviv in Israel. You could tell that I'm a developer advocate because I default to using the airport codes for cities instead of the full city name. Our journey today is first we're going to talk a bit about what is GitHub Actions. What can you do with GitHub Actions? And we're going to look at a brief overview of what they are, and then look at the CI/CD use case, which is perhaps the most common use case for GitHub Actions. And then we're going to take a little detour and look at how GitHub Actions can be used for things that are way out of the box, things you may not have even thought of that go far beyond the CI/CD, the testing use case. Then we're going to spend the bulk of our time discussing what I call the tooling challenge, which is how to build tooling that makes both the developers who are working on them, the users who are using them, most productive, most happy, and most capable in wanting to do it and use it and write it and just be part of the whole journey in that tooling, and how GitHub Actions as a path can help create tooling that's more accessible for the most amount of people. So first of all, what are GitHub Actions? GitHub Actions is a runtime environment provided by GitHub for free for most uses, most public repositories, that allows you to automate, customize, and execute your workflows. So for example, in the testing environment, you may have very specific needs on which you want to test your code or your library. You can customize that, you can automate it on a schedule, and you can execute it whenever you need to execute that schedule, all within the context of GitHub. The heart of a GitHub Actions project is the workflow. The workflow is where you define all of the parts, all the moving parts of your GitHub Actions action, and that is defined and written in YAML, one of our favorite languages, of course. And in YAML, you define the workflow by its name and what you want it to do. A workflow, as I mentioned briefly, can run in a variety of contexts. Most notably and most commonly, you might want to run it on every push to a feature branch, or you may want to run it when a new pull request is opened. You may want to run a certain GitHub action if somebody raises an issue in your GitHub repository, or if they leave a comment on a pull request, or if they are a first-time contributor, or all other kinds of examples. You can define all of those, any and one or any or all of those on the on key. You can also create actions to run on a schedule with a cron schedule, and you could do both. It can be run both on a certain defined activity, or it can be run on a certain defined schedule. In addition to that, the bulk of your action is within the jobs key. And you can have multiple jobs for a single action, and each job can have multiple steps. In this case, this comes directly from the GitHub Actions documentation. This one is called Explore GitHub Actions, this job, and it has a lot of different run steps, and most of them are simple echoes out to the console. But what you see in those echoes are the usage, the interpolation of both text, with emoji, of course, you have to have emojis, but also with variables. And you access variables in GitHub Actions by using the $ and open bracket, syntax. And you can get all different kinds of data out of GitHub and put it into your action. In fact, the API reference for GitHub is pretty much what you can do. What's defined there is pretty much what you can access here in your GitHub Actions workflow. And here you see that we're just echoing a bunch of text. This job is triggered by this GitHub event, and it's running on this OS. In this case, it's running on Ubuntu. You can actually define a matrix of OSs, and each one will run the action asynchronously, and each of those not asynchronously, synchronously in each of those runtime environments. So Ubuntu, Mac OS, Windows, etc. You can reference the repository name, all other sorts of good details and data you can add and interpolate into your GitHub Actions. The most common use case for GitHub Actions is, and many of you may have seen this already, is running it for testing as a testing suite. And there's a variety of other providers out there who can automate your testing suites for you in GitHub, but it may come as no surprise that GitHub Actions, being from GitHub, and if you're running your code and pushing your code up to GitHub, is perhaps the most seamless and integrated option out there. This is what it looks like from the GitHub website. This is a real life example of running a small testing suite for one of the toolings that we are actually going to talk about. And you see I run it in a matrix of environments, both versions of two different versions of Ruby and in two different environments, Ubuntu and Mac OS, and for Ruby 2.7 and Ruby 3, and they're all green, which means my tests pass. I can click into any one of those and I can see details. And for example, I expanded the one called Run Tests, and you see that the actual bulk, the heart of this workflow, is running RSpec. RSpec, for those of you who don't know Ruby, and if you don't know Ruby, you're welcome to learn Ruby anytime you'd like. RSpec is one of the main testing libraries, in Ruby. And I've defined a testing suite and I run it and I see that the examples I provided pass, which means I get those beautiful green check marks. GitHub Actions, though, is not only for testing. You could do a lot more with Actions that is not only about CI/CD. What else can you do with Actions? Well, I will show you. This action I wrote a while back. It's demonstrating how versatile GitHub Actions is by what is perhaps a bit of a far-fetched use case. This action, I called it, Are They Awake Yet? And what this action does is it looks for a specifically worded comment in a GitHub repository, and using the data in that comment, fetches that user that was tagged in the comment, their geolocated latitude and longitude, and then gets their time zone in the world and tells you the time and date for that user. So the albeit far-fetched use case is you're working in a remote team and you're working on some project and you don't know whether or not you should ping that person yet on about the project. Is it too early? Is it too late? Is it a weekend? You can ask in GitHub, are they awake yet? And GitHub will tell you and give you that data and empower you to decide whether or not you want to send them a message on Slack at this moment or not. And this is exactly what it looks like. Hey, is this person awake? And the GitHub Actions responds. You ask if this person was awake. I can't tell you about their personal sleeping habits, but I can tell you that it is 8:38 in the morning on Sunday for them. I hope that helps clarify the matter for you. And now you know, as the person, whether or not this colleague of yours likes to be pinged at 8:38 in the morning on Sunday. If they are, then go ahead. If they're not, then maybe you should wait maybe until 9 a.m. on Monday. This action, Are They Awake Yet?, gives you a good idea of the breadth and depth of possibilities that one can accomplish with GitHub Actions. Now, the question in hand for us is ultimately around tooling. Tooling, whether you're building developer tooling or tooling more broadly, is a really rich topic. And as any one of us who's worked in the space of tooling, whether as the developer, as the product manager, as the any other kind of role adjacent to that, knows that tooling is really hard. Tooling is hard to get right, both for the developers working on it and for the users who want to use it. For example, from the developer perspective, we all know that developers have their happy languages. They have their programming languages that they prefer to write their code in. It may be Ruby, it may be PHP, it may be C#, it may be Python. They derive the most satisfaction working in those languages. And they may say, I want to write this code in my preferred language. The problem is there is a plethora of languages out there. And if you're building tooling in a developer first or developer plus kind of space, you need to build redundancies, because you will have users who like to work in tooling in Python or Java or JavaScript or C# or C++ or PHP, and you need to make sure that you can accommodate all those folks. That's a lot of tools, a lot of redundant tools. So requirement number one for us at Orbit, as we were building these community integration tools, was, and we're going to talk about what they were in just a moment, is that developers can code in their preferred language. The second requirement, and this is from the user perspective, is, let's say I write a Ruby gem, and I have written Ruby gems for Orbit, and I write a Ruby gem for Orbit for some tooling, and the user says, that's lovely, but I don't know how to use a package in Ruby. I like to use packages, I like to use Node packages, or I'm a PHP developer, or I write in Python, and it's all well and good that you wrote this in Ruby, but I don't know Ruby. What am I supposed to do with this? So requirement number two for us was users don't need to know the language of the tool that it was written in. In fact, they don't even need to care about that at all. And they shouldn't have to care about the language of the tool that it was written in. Third, and this perhaps needs to be really emphasized, when we build tooling, we often think of the user in the model of us, the builder. And for us, for many of us, working in the context of a CLI is quite intuitive. It's quite natural. It's quite normal. You're used to it. You may even enjoy it. I enjoy it. But there are many users, and not all of our users are developers, who will turn back to you and say right away, what's a CLI? What are those three letters? I don't want to open my terminal. I don't know how to use a terminal. This is all great that you built this, but I have no idea how to use it. So if that's the case, if we want to create tooling that's accessible for people who use CLIs and those who don't use CLIs, we need to build tooling, and we need to make sure that we meet the requirement that users can use that tool without the command line. So to recap, we really have three core requirements here that are essential in the building of these tools. That the developer can code in their preferred language, that users don't need to know the language that the developer wrote in, and that users don't need to be developers or know how to use a command line interface. That is a lot of work, and you may even think to yourself that is impossible. You may be looking at that as like a Rubik's Cube and saying, I can't solve this. But happily and joyfully, I'm here to tell you that I think that GitHub Actions is the solution, if not the solution, is a solution to help you in this path of building tooling that can be used by many more people than maybe was possible before. And I wanted to show you how that's done with a single case study. The case study here is the combination of data from the dev community blog into Orbit. Orbit, as I mentioned, we call it mission control for community builders. It provides for folks who are building product communities, user communities, all kinds of communities, the tooling, the analytics, the reporting, and the insights to be able to grow your community and to understand your community even more, both on the individual level and on the meta level. And Dev is, as for those of you who don't know, is this fantastic resource, primarily a blog, but really a gathering spot for people, developers and developer adjacent folks to share their learning and to communicate and build fellowship together. And a lot of people in your product or user communities may live on Dev, and you may want to incorporate the interactions you have with them on Dev into your Orbit workspace, into your Orbit understanding of your community. And in fact, that's what a lot of people want to do, because a basic understanding that Orbit comes to community with is that community lives in many places, and you want to be able to integrate all those places into a single view, into a single understanding of your community. So when you look at your Orbit community, this is an example of a user profile. So drilling down to the person, you get to see all the places that you interact with them, whether it's Twitter or GitHub or Discord or email, et cetera, et cetera. You get to see who they are in a snapshot. You get to understand their activity over time. For example, this person took a bit of a break on February of 2021. What's that big break about? But they did seem to come back with a vengeance in May of 2021. And you can see also color-coded where their community activity was centered around. And you get a nice timeline of their activity. For example, their most recent activity was a message sent to Discord, and you see the channel and the message. What we want to do, our use case, is we want to add the dev comments that are related to our community into our Orbit workspace on the user level and on the community level. So we get that same kind of look, that same kind of view, but also for the comments that person and other people leave on dev in relationship to us and our product, our user community, whatever kind of community we are building. And we do that in order to derive and build and gain insight with these kind of reporting and analytics that help us make better informed, more well-informed decisions. Well, of course, you can always think about using the APIs. And in fact, Orbit and Dev, in our use case, both have accessible and open APIs built on REST. You can extract the data from the Dev community blog using their Dev API, and you can input the data into your Orbit workspace using the API. But we ought not forget that what we are building, what our objective here is to do, is to build accessible tooling. And if that's the case, we can't assume that everyone wants to build their own tools, their own libraries, their own functions, or wants to explore in Postman or build curl commands to access APIs on both ends and play with data in JSON. And if that's the case, we need to build tooling that uses the API, but also accomplishes the requirements as outlined here, which is at the base of the tool we're going to build is essentially a tool that leverages two APIs. It leverages the Dev API on one hand and leverages the Orbit API on the other hand, but it does so by letting the person writing it write in whatever language they want to, by not assuming that the user has to know that language, and also by not assuming that the user is a developer or wants to build anything on a command line and never needs to open their terminal in order to use this tool that is leveraging APIs but abstracting the use of the API away from the user so that they can do what they need to do most productively and quickly with a little pain and hopefully a lot of happiness. So in this case, this particular tool was built in Ruby because why? Because requirement number one, developers can write in the language they want to. I wrote this tool, so it is written in Ruby, which is lovely. And here's an example of the tool that was built. This is a method that takes the data that we have now fetched from Dev and constructs it in the right hash to send as JSON to Orbit. And so we see we have an activity type, which is a dev and the comment. You can also have a dev and a post and a dev and all other types of interactions you might get from dev. You see that we give it a unique key, dev comment with the ID of the comment. We interpolate the title, we get the comment of the body, and we also get information about the user who posted the comment, their name, their dev2 profile username, and if they put in their dev profile things like their Twitter username and their GitHub handle and their personal URL, we also fetch that data and add it to the hash to give over to Orbit. This gem is being used. It's out in the world. Surprisingly, it makes me so happy. It's been used by over 11,000 downloads of this gem, which is great. It's actually frequently used. It's wonderful. But what if I don't know Ruby? I built this as a Ruby gem. It does its job fairly well. It's well tested. It accounts for a lot of different edge cases, and you just have to run it on the CLI. You can open your terminal, run the gem as an executable, give it the parameters it needs, and it'll do all the work for you. But what if you don't know Ruby? What if you don't know CLIs? What if you don't know how? You do know CLIs, but you don't know how to run a Ruby gem with Bundler from the terminal? Those are all fair points. So in that case, there are 3 ways to use this integration. And in fact, there are 3 ways to use all of the tools that we built using this paradigm. 1, you can, if you're a developer and you're building your own library, you can install this package and run it in your own app. If you're comfortable using the CLI, you can run the CLI on demand directly from your terminal. And if you are not either of those things, or you are, but you want the convenience, you can schedule the automation with GitHub. And you notice the way we phrased it, because we don't use languages like our terminology, like GitHub Action. We don't say schedule a GitHub Action workflow, because that language itself is also a bit jargony. We say you can schedule an automation with GitHub, get started in minutes, no coding required. And this is what that automation actually looks like. In this case, I took it from a real life Orbit user using it for their organization. This is actually not from the dev integration. It's from the integration that takes in Circle, which is another social community platform, takes in the interactions from there and adds them to Orbit, but it's exactly the same thing. And I expanded on the bulk of the matter, the thing that took exactly 6 seconds to run, which is to check for new comments in their Circle spaces. And you'll notice that every single day this runs. And for example, in this workflow, you'll notice it fetched 26 new comments and added them to the Orbit workspace. And for this particular user, every day there are dozens of new comments being fetched from their Circle spaces and adding it to their Orbit data to provide more richer and I would say more complete picture of their community within their Orbit workspace. It's important to always remember the following, to always check your assumptions. And this may come as a surprise for some of us. GitHub is not intuitive for everyone. And sometimes we assume the things we use the most are intuitive. They're intuitive for us because we use them the most. But that doesn't mean they're intuitive for everyone else. And if that's the case, we ought not to assume any step of the process. No matter how basic that step is, basic to us, we ought not to assume it's basic to anyone else. And we should and we must document everything. And we should document it with multiple modalities. So that means including written word, obviously, but in addition to the written word, in addition to text, making sure to include graphics and charts and arrows and boxes and with appropriate videos, because the more modalities you include in your documentation, the more types of learners you're able to reach, and therefore the more amount of users you're able to empower, and the more people you, at the end of the day, make happy in the work they must and should do. Tooling can be more accessible. It can be more accessible for people who code and people who don't code. People who only code in JavaScript or only code in PHP. People who love CLIs and people who hate CLIs, and more. And I believe that GitHub Actions can help us get there. Thank you so much, and I look forward to talking to all of you throughout the rest of the conference.